The Allied powers ultimately defeated Germany and Japan in World War II, but that victory was far from assured. What would happen if the Third Reich had won the war in Europe? Would Germany have control of Africa? Keep watching to find out. It's a well-known fact that the Nazis killed 6 million European Jews as part of the so-called final solution, as well as large swaths of other vulnerable populations. The genocide ended with the Allied invasions of Germany and Poland at the end of the war, as part of the German defeat. Had Hitler and the Germans never lost, the program of organized death would likely have continued apace, presumably on track to kill off much more of the Jewish population on the continent. Horrific as the legacy of the Holocaust has been, could it have been even worse? The Holocaust Encyclopedia, published by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, put the total Jewish population of Europe at about 9.5 million. By those figures, another 3.5 million people could have eventually been killed, adding even more souls to the already grim tally. The real figure may have been slightly lower, though. The 9.5 million cited included the Jews of the Soviet Union, tens of thousands of whom lived in the autonomous Jewish oblast of Russia's Chinese frontier. These people lived far from Nazi territorial ambition. 9 to 9.5 million people seems like an inevitable, if truly bleak, toll. Hitler was serious about establishing a new German land empire. By 1942, Hitler ruled most of the European continent and huge sections of the Soviet Union as well, all the way to the Caspian Sea.
And then he's going to turn his attention to the east, which he sees as the natural field for German expansion.
Contrary to popular belief, though, Hitler didn't aim to conquer the world. He planned for Russia's Ural Mountains to form the eastern perimeter of the Third Reich. It's unclear, though, what Hitler wanted to do with the UK. The Nazis had planned Operation Sea Lion to occupy the British Isles, but Hitler seemed to go back and forth on whether England belonged in the Third Reich in the cultural sense. Operation Sea Lion would have been a bloodbath if it had ever been launched, but its corollary, Operation Green, the plan to invade Ireland, would have likely gone much more smoothly for the Germans. The Irish Times reports that the Irish army was seriously outgunned, with many of its divisions relying on bicycles, earning them the sneering nickname of pedaling panzers. But as in England's case, it's not clear that the Celtic island was Third Reich material. We can imagine that after its occupation and the extermination of its Jews and other vulnerable peoples, Ireland might have been permitted nominal independence and a docile pro-German dictator. So what about the fate of the United States? Hitler had no plans for invading the USA. He underestimated America's fighting capability, refusing to believe that a nation of mongrels could defeat his Aryan empire. The logistics, too, would have been even more daunting. With the Wehrmacht already stretched thin across Europe and Africa, occupying another large continent would have been impossible. Canada, a British subject, might have fared worse with Hitler as its head of state instead of King George VI. This means, however, that the United States could potentially keep fighting. Another atom bomb might have ended up being dropped on Berlin or another European city, decimating them like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1941, the U.S. Air Force began work on the Convair B-36 bomber, which could reach Berlin from a Canadian air base without refueling. The B-36 would not be ready for mass production until 1948, the year America's atom bomb arsenal reached 50 warheads. That's 50 cities worth of carnage, enough perhaps to bring the worldwide Third Reich to its knees. It's not guaranteed that Japan would win its war against the Allies if Germany won its own, but a German victory would mean the subjugation of the British Empire, including Australia, as well as the Soviet Union and possibly the United States.
But our greatest days, they lie ahead. Sig Heil.
With its enemies out of commission, Japan's brutal expansion would theoretically meet almost no opposition. Japan would be the master of the Pacific, from the western shores of North America to the border of India. It would have been the biggest sovereign power in the world. Once Hitler had seized the oil and rich farmland west of the Urals, he planned to hand the rest of the defunct Soviet Union to Japan. The empire of the rising sun would certainly have swallowed more of mainland China. They would have also taken the American territories in the Pacific like Hawaii and Guam, all of Southeast Asia, and possibly Alaska. Japan had already taken British colonies like Singapore, many of which are major economic forces today. If Japan had enforced its insulated economic policies on these islands, the 21st century economic landscape would be completely different. Without Asian trade and manufacturing, there would be no globalization. Germany, too, had Pacific colonies directly in the Japanese Empire's path. It's unclear whether Hitler would have had to concede Germany's former Pacific colonies to his Asian allies, or if he would fight to reclaim them. Germany lost its colonies, including all outside the borders of Europe, in the Treaty of Versailles, which effectively ended World War I. These included the aforementioned islands in the Pacific, but more importantly, a significant number of African territories as well. These included regions like Cameroon and Togo in the west of Africa, Tanganyika, now known as Tanzania, and Burundi in the east of Africa, and Namibia in Africa's southwest. Hitler was determined to restore German control of these countries. He also planned to seize the colonies of his defeated European rivals, most notably France and Britain. Most of Africa, besides the Italian, Vichy French, and the Spanish enclaves, would likely be speaking German and flying a swastika banner. The Nazis enjoyed a fair amount of support among some of South Africa's Afrikaner population, which had historically opposed British rule and was quite experienced in creating and dominating a racial underclass. Some South Africans even formed pro-Nazi militias in anticipation of their unification with the Third Reich. It's not hard to imagine an African managerial caste reporting to Berlin and manned by Afrikaners, enforced by some version of apartheid from the Sahara to Madagascar. Is it nature or nurture that creates a monster like Adolf Hitler? It's an age-old question that is unlikely to ever be answered. You might assume that a dictator who was responsible for the Holocaust and millions of deaths would have been raised by monsters himself. By all accounts, his father Alois Hitler terrorized and tormented him as a child, but his mother is a different story. Clara Hitler was an entirely devoted mother to her son. Although she had 3 children before him, Hitler was the first to survive infancy. Clara did what she could to protect her son from her husband's beatings, and she often comforted him once they were over. Clara has been described as having a gentle smile and being reserved and quiet, whereas Alois was something of a bad-tempered bully. Hitler's sister Paula once described the couple's dynamic, saying, "My mother was a very soft and tender person, the compensatory element between the almost too harsh father."
When my brother Adolf was about 2 years old, he once climbed up a ladder to the top rung. Mother heard that he was up there on the ladder and was frightened to death.
Clara, Alois's third wife, was young enough to be his daughter and first joined his household as his maid. She even called him uncle and later found it difficult not to refer to him as such after they were married. When Alois married for the second time, Clara left the family home. Then, when his second wife became ill, she returned to take care of Alois's children at home. By the time his wife died, Clara was pregnant. The cousins had to ask permission from the church to wed, and in 1885 they officially became man and wife. When Alois died in 1903, Clara was left to raise her teenage son alone. By 1905, she allowed him to drop out of school after he convinced her that he was too ill and could no longer attend. By then, he was doing poorly in school and spent the next couple of years drawing, reading, and learning about fine arts. In 1907, Hitler turned 18, and Clara wholeheartedly approved of her son's plan to move to Vienna and become an artist. When he showed interest in becoming a musician too, Clara bought him a grand piano. She doted on him immensely and provided him with both emotional and financial support. Hitler himself once referred to that brief period in his life as, quote, "the happiest days," a time that felt to him almost like a dream. And then, to Hitler's dismay, Clara contracted cancer. The timing of Hitler's mother's illness coincided with his efforts to pursue art in Vienna, and things grew worse when he failed the entrance exam to be admitted to the Academy of Fine Arts. That's when he went home to help take care of his mother. Clara subsequently underwent a mastectomy and continued a number of painful treatments at home. She also endured newly developed and experimental chemotherapies, which ended up paralyzing her throat, making her unable to swallow. At that time, Hitler would sleep in the kitchen with his mother because that was the warmest place in the home. In the end, Adolf Hitler was powerless to stop his mother from dying at just 47 years old on December 21, 1907. The death of Hitler's mother devastated him. Edward Bloch, a Jewish doctor who diagnosed and treated Clara, later wrote of what he saw when he went to Clara's home to sign her death certificate. "In all my career, I never saw anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler." Hitler eventually named Clara's birthday, August 12th, as the Day of Honor for the German mother. All throughout his abhorrent political career, he kept photos of his kind and nurturing mother with him everywhere he went. And when Hitler killed himself in a Berlin bunker in 1945, he still had a picture of his mother with him. It was the closing days of a war that claimed the lives of millions and the end of the rise of the Third Reich. How did it end? Deep underground? With another death that was more tragic to witnesses than the end of Hitler himself? By the spring of 1945, Russia's Red Army was converging on Berlin, and Adolf Hitler, with his longtime mistress Eva Braun, had retreated to the so-called Führer bunker, an above and below-ground complex near the Reich Chancellery, the center of Nazi government in the German capital. Construction on the Führer bunker began in 1936 before war even broke out. It was finished in 2 stages, the last one concluded in 1944. The Führer bunker was 2 connected shelters, and it was finally appointed with expensive rugs and art, among other luxuries. Soon, life in the bunker became chaotic, and addicted to opiates and living with Parkinson's disease, Hitler's health only worsened along with the prospects of winning the war. In the Fuhrer bunker along with Hitler was Nazi chief propagandist Joseph Goebbels and Hitler's own private secretary. That was Martin Bormann, a longtime member of Hitler's inner circle and the man who controlled access to the Fuhrer. Hitler, Braun, and Goebbels' wife and family, who were also in hiding, would all kill themselves just hours before the fall of Berlin. With those deaths and the subsequent Allied victory, the Third Reich was no more, and the Second World War, in Europe at least, had mercifully come to a close. Thanks in part to the book Hitler's Last Day, Minute by Minute, the final hours of Hitler's life are recorded in chilling detail.
Did you ever hear him mention suicide?
Yes, after April 22nd. He talked about it constantly.
As the story unfolded, the fate of those hidden with Hitler became clear, and one of history's darkest moments was resolved as Adolf Hitler, among mankind's most brutal and malicious dictators, came to his end. In total, Hitler would spend 105 days living underground. The last time Hitler ever saw the sunshine was on April 20th, his 56th birthday. After that point, he never emerged from the Fuhrer bunker again. With news that Italian fascist dictator and Hitler ally Benito Mussolini was captured and killed by Allied forces, and with many of Hitler's inner circle turning on him, it was becoming clearer and clearer that the war was lost and the Third Reich was finished. Supplies and munitions were running low for the German army, and the Soviets were expected to take Berlin at any moment. Hitler had one final task to complete before he carried out his final act, though, as Sky History notes. Only a matter of days before Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun would end their lives, the couple decided to get married. The marriage ceremony was performed by Walter Wagner, an attorney, notary, and devout Nazi who had reportedly never even met Hitler before the wedding ceremony. In the civil ceremony, both pledged they were of pure Aryan blood, in keeping with Hitler's philosophy of racial superiority and of a master race. The wedding was followed by a somber reception. Once married, Hitler dictated his final will and testament. The following day, Hitler received an update on how the German army was proceeding. It would only be a matter of hours before the Red Army took control of Berlin. A teenage Hitler youth courier named Armin Lehmann, who was in the Fuhrer bunker in those final hours but survived, described Hitler like a ghost, staring ahead lost in thought. When a mortar struck the ground above the bunker, Lehmann later recalled, "Dirt and mortar trickled down on us, but he made no attempt to brush it off. He looked so much more unhealthy than 10 days earlier at his birthday reception. It looked like he was suffering from jaundice. His face was sallow." A telephone operator, Rokas Mish, described what it was like as the days wore on.
Everybody was already half dead. It was very close to the end. I don't know if you can imagine what those days were like.
Along with Hitler, Braun, and other members of the Nazi brass in the Fuhrer bunker was Hitler's dog, a German shepherd named Blondie. Blondie had been given to Hitler in 1941 by his private secretary Martin Bormann, and it was said that Hitler and the dog were very close. According to some, the relationship was closer than Hitler was even with Braun. In the 2006 book, The Lost Life of Eva Braun, it was said, "He was more publicly demonstrative to his dog, hugging and kissing her." Hitler's affection for dogs played into Nazi propaganda that attempted to portray him as an animal lover. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that only went so far. According to Hitler and Braun's suicide pact, the two would die side by side. Braun would ingest cyanide, and Hitler would both ingest cyanide and shoot himself in the temple. Braun forgoed adding a gunshot to her suicide by cyanide, reportedly saying, "I want to be a beautiful corpse." First, though, Blondie would also die to test the effectiveness of the cyanide capsule one day prior to Hitler and Braun's own suicide. One of only two survivors from the Fuhrer bunker later recalled the death of the dog affecting those in the underground bomb shelter more so than the death of Eva Braun. On April 30th, 1945, and with Allied forces advancing, Adolf Hitler decided the time had come for himself and his wife to follow through on their plan to kill themselves, rather than face possible capture by Allied forces. Around noon on that day, Hitler told Bormann, "The time has come. Fraulein Braun and I will end our lives this afternoon." After eating his final meal of spaghetti and salad, Hitler met with Goebbels, who urged the tyrant to reconsider and to escape instead. Hitler would not be moved, telling him, "You know my decision. I'm not going to change it." At that point, Hitler and Braun entered their private chambers for the final time. A shot rang out through the bunker, and Hitler was later discovered, bloodied and slumped over, with Braun by his side. History says that their bodies were cremated in the Chancellery Garden per Hitler's wishes. Also keeping with Hitler's final will and testament, Goebbels was named Chancellor in Hitler's stead, but Goebbels too would die by suicide along with his family. As predicted, Berlin fell to the Allies with an unconditional surrender from the Germans 8 days later, and one of the worst moments in world history had finally come to a close. The Nazi leader and German dictator Adolf Hitler took his own life on April 30th, 1945 by shooting himself in a Berlin bunker as the British, Americans, and Soviets closed in around him. The day before he ended his life, he had married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, who joined him in suicide by ingesting a cyanide pill. To test the pills, Hitler first fed one to his dog, Blondie, to make sure they worked. The day before Hitler's death, he dictated his final will and testament. Hitler's first order of business was to explain his motives for finally marrying his mistress of 16 years. Essentially, Hitler explained he had been too busy to be a proper husband.
There was a time where Eva Braun wanted Hitler to marry her.
Hitler sagte, ich werde nie heiraten.
Hitler said, I shall never marry.
Now that he was losing the war, however, he decided he would take Braun as his wife. Hitler's will read, I have now decided, before the closing of my earthly career, to take as my wife that girl who, after many years of faithful friendship, entered of her own free will the practically besieged town in order to share her destiny with me. At her own desire, she goes as my wife with me into death. At this point, Hitler's regime had overseen the killing of an estimated 17 million people. The Nazi Party sought to eliminate various ethnic groups, most commonly Jews, and others who were deemed tainted in some way, including Romani travelers, homosexuals, criminals, and the disabled. While Hitler's plans were abhorrent by almost any standards, Eva Braun was genuinely dedicated to her lover, even as he doled out his affection in crumbs. At least that's the way Braun made it sound in her 1935 diary entries, written when she was just 23 years old. At the end of her anguished entries and want of Hitler's love and attention, Braun says she has written to him one last time, and if he didn't respond, she was going to take 35 pills and end her life. She soon followed through on this threat. Though her attempt was unsuccessful, it did at least grab the Führer's attention. He even added her to his first will in 1938. In that testament, Braun was placed at the top. It stated that if Hitler were to die, Braun would receive a certain amount of money per year for the rest of her life. For her part, she remained ever loyal to her Führer, writing in a letter, From our first meeting, I swore to follow you anywhere, even unto death. I live only for your love. Hitler wrote that early version of his will by hand and signed it on May 2, 1938. It is theorized he had it made not because he feared death by his enemies, but because he had fistulas and thought he might have cancer. This initial version of Hitler's will was later discovered in the ruins of the Reichschancellery in 1945, but his final will was written in an entirely different light. He knew by April 1945 that he was beaten, and had decided to end his life rather than face his captors-to-be. Since he didn't have any children, Hitler said in his final will that he wanted to leave his possessions to the party. He wrote, Should this no longer exist, to the state. Should the state also be destroyed, no further decision of mine is necessary. Hitler also requested his collected photos be added to a gallery in his hometown. He named his Nazi comrade Martin Bormann his executor. Bormann was also tasked with working out what items may have sentimental value to Hitler's family, along with any resources to ensure they had enough for the maintenance of a modest, simple life. Above all, Hitler wanted to ensure Braun's mother and his own colleagues were well taken care of. Finally, Hitler's will stated that he and his wife's bodies should be burned immediately on the spot, as the dictator feared his body being put on view by the Allies. Subsequently, his aides secured at least 47 gallons of gasoline. They burned Hitler and Braun's bodies over the span of 2.5 hours until there was nothing left but ash.
You may already know that Adolf Hitler kept his official residence at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. However, the so-called Führer wasn't content with just one residence. Located out of sight, deep in the Masurian woods in what was then East Prussia, Hitler spent more than 800 days in the Wolf's Lair. This secret command post has served as Germany's military headquarters for the Eastern Front. From this fortified post, Hitler and his generals devised military strategies utilized for the invasion of Eastern Europe, as well as plans for the construction of his death camps. The Wolf Lair's location was selected for its many strategic advantages. First and foremost, it was a secure spot, hidden on almost all sides by forest, and protected on the east by the Great Masurian Lakes. These natural obstacles were then additionally fortified using resources such as anti-tank trenches, barbed wire fences, and landmines. With over 80 buildings and more than 30 bunkers spread out over 2.5 square miles of land, the Wolf's Lair required a large staff to keep the residence up and running. While the lair itself could accommodate around 2,000 people, including high-ranking Nazi officers, it also housed live-in employees to manage operations around the camp. At least 3,000 to 5,000 people were reportedly employed at the Wolf's Lair, although the true number may have even been higher. Among the staff were many young women who worked as taste testers, sampling Hitler's food before it was served to him to ensure it hadn't been poisoned. Nevertheless, these stringent security measures failed to prevent an assassination attempt from occurring inside the Wolf's Lair itself. On July 20th, 1944, the German staff officer Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg put into place a plan to kill the dictator. Dubbed Operation Valkyrie, von Stauffenberg smuggled a bomb hidden inside his briefcase, which he intended to explode during a meeting held in one of the base's conference rooms. But the plan was foiled at the last minute when another officer pushed the briefcase containing the bomb to the edge of the conference room table. When it detonated at 12:42 p.m., the explosion was obscured by the heavy table, shielding Hitler from the worst of the blast. Although Hitler survived, 4 others died and many more were injured. After the plot was exposed, von Stauffenberg was executed by firing squad, along with almost 200 other Germans who were suspected of having been involved. Just a few months later, in November 1944, the Red Army's advance into East Prussia forced Hitler and his officers to abandon their command post at the Wolf's Lair. In January 1945, Hitler ordered the buildings at Wolf's Lair destroyed. Using thousands of tons of TNT, SS officers attempted to blow up the former command post. Despite all the damage, however, many of the sturdy bunkers remained standing. However, the landmines that had been spread throughout the grounds were left active and remained active until as late as the mid-1950s. After the end of the war, the Wolf's Lair was left to rack and ruin. With nobody to maintain the grounds, nature eventually began to overrun much of the base as time passed. However, it remained a site of much interest to the public, often drawing curious tourists and other visitors.
What really happened and what these places really looked like is something you can't get a sense of visually just from reading about it.
In 2017, the Polish Forestry Inspectorate took control of Wolf's Lair, turning it into an historic and controversial tourist site. While some believe that it is important for people to learn about the area's history, others fear that Hitler's former outpost may serve as a rallying point for neo-Nazis and other fascists. However, tour guides say very few neo-Nazis visit the site these days. One told the DW, "That's really just a few, not more than a few percent. Neo-Nazis don't really come here." Today, only a single bunker remains completely intact, which once housed Hitler's personal security detail. It now serves as a small restaurant and hotel. Hitler's own bunker, number 13, is still standing, although the exterior has suffered some damage and the interior has been completely destroyed. Suitably, the site also includes a memorial to Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and Operation Valkyrie.
80 years after Adolf Hitler's murderous reign, the horrors he created continue to astonish. These lesser-known facts about the Nazi dictator shed light on the depth of his evil. It wasn't enough for Hitler and the Nazi leadership to kill millions of people. They took their evil a step further by making use of the body parts of their victims. Upon arrival at a concentration camp, a prisoner's hair was shaved off. This was a way to dehumanize Jews and other captives, but there was more than one reason behind it. The hair would be cured above a camp's crematorium and then gathered into bales. From there, it was spun into thread and used for making rope for ships, stuffing mattresses, and even making detonator cords for time-delayed bombs. But there were even creepier uses for the hair-infused thread. It was woven into the clothing of Nazi troops. The fibers were used in socks for sailors stationed on submarines, as a lining in uniforms, and as insulating material for cold weather boots. Moreover, the use of the hair was such a priority that camp personnel were required to submit periodic reports on the amount of hair collected. Piles of unused hair still remain today and are displayed in museums as a grim reminder of the immense scale and barbarity of the Nazi death camps.
We are in the most efficient, or at least one of the most efficient killing fields ever created by mankind.
The fact that Nazi leadership felt no shame over using the hair of their prisoners for clothing and other items illustrates how completely their warped mindset saw Jews and other so-called undesirables as less than human. Hitler didn't just rely on physical torture in Nazi concentration camps, but psychological torture as well. One of the most gut-wrenching examples of the latter was forcing slave laborers to sing and dance for the guards' entertainment, as revealed in Music and Torture and Nazi Sites of Persecution and Genocide in Occupied Poland. In the paper, one former prisoner recalled how the Nazis forced women to sing while they executed male prisoners, many of whom were their friends and family. The survivor remembered the scene punctuated with the sound of gunshots intermingled with the melodies of the forced songs.
I remember singing Madame Butterfly at 3 o'clock in the morning for a bunch of SS who were very tired of killing people.
Songs were often a daily ritual as part of the afternoon roll call. This meant prisoners would sing and dance after spending the day completing tasks such as cleaning blood off gas chamber walls or sorting through the clothing of dead Jews. One survivor is quoted saying, "I am aghast. They kill people there, in the chamber, and we are to sing." Worse, many of the songs were written specifically for the prisoners and included lyrics that cruelly mocked their fates. At Treblinka, an extermination camp that killed around 925,000 Jews and an untold number of Poles, Roma, and Soviet POWs, prisoners were forced to sing an anthem with the lyrics, "Because our fate is Tarara, that's why we're in Treblinka today, and sent here for this short time." Though children are generally considered the most innocent and helpless members of society, the Nazis had no shame in torturing and killing babies, toddlers, and kids. In fact, members of the regime often actually targeted children. There were two sick reasons behind the policy. The first was that children were a drain on resources and had little to no value as laborers. The Nazis couldn't make a profit off their child prisoners. And as the Nazis were obsessed with creating an Aryan master race, anyone else of reproductive age or who could reproduce in the future had to be exterminated. As explained by the Holocaust Encyclopedia, children posed a particular threat to the Nazis' plan to annihilate the Jewish people, because were they to survive, they would grow up to parent a new generation of Jews. Children were often the first to be condemned to death in the camps, and were sometimes driven away as their parents watched. This horror was recreated in a heart-wrenching scene in the film Sophie's Choice. Women who were pregnant or of childbearing age were treated similarly, and often sent to the gas chambers first, as part of the Nazi Selektion, or selection process. One of the most striking facts of World War II is that Hitler decided to prioritize killing Jews and other prisoners over saving Germany. Professor Jordan Peterson pointed out that when they realized they were losing the war, the Nazis diverted troops and resources from the front lines to execute the final solution. Leadership would have to have questioned the value of continuing to exterminate prisoners while suffering defeat after defeat on the battlefield. The controversial Peterson added that the logical move would have been to keep as many prisoners alive as possible for slave labor in the support of the Third Reich. Peterson laid out the two options facing German commanders, saying, "You can suspend your strategically unnecessary demolition of people, win the war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or, while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem even though it's counterproductive." But even though pausing the murder of concentration camp prisoners might have helped the Nazis temporarily stave off defeat, Hitler and the other Nazi officials decided that their hatred of Jews and other non-Aryan people trumped their desire for victory. It was a pathologically evil decision. Hitler found it cruel to consume meat and was a vegetarian, though it's been speculated that he sometimes indulged in a sausage or two. In fact, Nazi Germany enacted scores of animal rights laws and even established one of the first international conferences on animal protection.
It is forbidden to force-feed poultry. It is forbidden to abandon your pet.
German schools were required to have curriculums focused on the humane treatment of animals, and medical researchers were severely restricted when it came to animal testing. Meanwhile, scientists in concentration camps performed gruesome human experiments without issue. It gets worse. The Nazi Party was the first governing body in the world to pass laws to protect animals used in film, and animal abusers were sentenced to up to 2 years in prison if found guilty. Heinrich Himmler, the mastermind of the extermination camps, even asked his doctor and avid hunter, "How can you find pleasure in shooting from behind at poor creatures browsing on the edge of a wood? It is really murder." In his manifesto Mein Kampf, Hitler admitted that he would give some of his food to mice if they looked like they were hungry. It's hard to fathom how Hitler and the Nazi regime were able to fret about the ethics of horse racing, yet were monstrous enough to encourage horrors such as throwing babies directly into ovens. How do you make a monster? Just ask Alois and Clara Hitler, two lovers with a disturbing connection. When it comes to investigating a man like Adolf Hitler, no fact is left untouched. This is especially true regarding Hitler's childhood, as many wonder if it may have contributed to his brutal ideology and meteoric rise to power. One interesting aspect of Hitler's upbringing is his family tree. The future Führer's family was strange in a variety of ways, including the relationship between his mother, Clara Potzel, and his father, Alois Hitler. How? Well, it would appear that Hitler's parents were second cousins, although other reports indicate that Clara may have been Alois's half-niece. Whatever the case, the two were related, and they both knew each other as relatives long before their marriage. Clara was brought into her future husband's home as a housemaid, where she worked for him until he married his second wife, Franziska Matzelsberger. When Alois and Franziska married, she asked her husband to dismiss the young maid, she saw as a threat to her marriage. He did so, but when Franziska became sick with tuberculosis, Clara returned to his home to assist with his children, Alois Jr. and Angela Hitler. The connection between Alois and Clara was more than just that of second cousins, however. For one thing, the age gap between the two was wide enough that Clara could have easily been Alois's daughter. Despite this, Clara was pregnant with his child by the time Matzelsberger died in 1884. Weirder still, Clara referred to him as uncle, even after they married. Because Clara and Alois were second cousins, they needed permission from the church to marry. Ultimately, the institution gave its approval and the pair walked down the aisle on January 7, 1885. At the time, Clara was heavily pregnant, and after a brief mourning ceremony, Alois returned to work. Clara and Alois went on to have 6 children together. Adolf and his sister Paula were the only 2 of their children to reach adulthood. Because Adolf was Clara's first surviving child, the 2 became very close. Paula would later describe Clara Hitler as a very soft and tender person when it came to her children.
When my brother Adolf was about 2 years old, he once climbed up a ladder to the top rung. Mother heard that he was up there on the ladder and was frightened to death.
Nevertheless, Hitler's childhood was anything but ideal, mostly because Alois was Clara's complete opposite. He was a domineering man who moved his family around Austria frequently. He was also violent towards his children and possibly his wife. According to Ian Kershaw's book Hitler, Paula later recounted that when her parents argued, it was always on account of the children. It was especially my brother Adolf who challenged my father to extreme harshness and who got his sound thrashing every day. How often, on the other hand, did my mother caress him and try to obtain with her kindness what the father could not succeed in obtaining with harshness? Adolf Hitler never claimed to love his father, and he did not mourn when Alois died unexpectedly in 1903. He did love his mother, however. In fact, Clara's doctor, Eduard Bloch, found the mother and son's relationship quite peculiar. He once explained, "While he was not a mother's boy in the usual sense, I have never witnessed a closer attachment." Some have theorized that Hitler had developed an Oedipus complex. When his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, he cared for her, cleaning the house, cooking, and performing other tasks. Likewise, Hitler also managed to hold back his anger when he was with Clara, something he struggled with throughout his life. Clara Hitler died on December 21, 1907 at 47. For the New York Times, Bloch later said of Clara's death, "I've never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler." In his memoir, Mein Kampf, Hitler admitted that his mother's death devastated him and ultimately changed the course of his life. Whatever the case, it is highly likely that this unusual upbringing may have made an indelible impact on the man who became a monster. An escape to Argentina, a secret base in Antarctica, a massive cover-up, the truth is far less sensational. It goes without saying that history's worst dictator, or one of the worst dictators of the past couple hundred years, along with Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot, is Adolf Hitler. The atrocities carried out by the German Chancellor need not be rehashed here. But for all of the conquest and mass murder carried out in his name, Hitler came to a rather inglorious end. With Allied troops closing in on Berlin and the fall of Nazi Germany imminent, Hitler hunkered in his bunker underground, popped a cyanide pill, and shot himself in the head. He married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, the day before.
He feared that he might only be wounded and captured, and then the Russians would degrade him.
Then, in accordance with his wishes, his men burned his body with gasoline. However, because real cremation of a body requires greater temperatures than that generated by a lit accelerant, some of Hitler's remains survived. What happened next was a matter of dispute for decades, but in 2018, the question of what happened to Hitler's body was settled once and for all by a French forensics team. For a while, a conspiracy theory held that Hitler hadn't actually died in his bunker. Instead, the story went that he escaped to Argentina with Nazi officials such as Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele, and lived out the rest of his life without facing justice. Other way-out theories regarding Hitler's death involve a secret Nazi base in Antarctica and a secret Nazi base on the moon, of all places. Such talk flew in the face of the claims of the USSR, who said that Soviet troops had found and collected skull fragments, jaw fragments, and teeth belonging to Hitler mere days after his suicide and immolation. But interestingly enough, claims that Hitler was alive were spread by none other than the Soviet Union itself under the nickname Operation Myth. Stalin wanted the world to think that American and British forces were hiding Hitler as part of a massive cover-up.
Knowing something the others don't know is always advantageous. Keeping a secret can always be useful.
As of 2018, we have conclusive evidence regarding the fate of Hitler's charred remains. The Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB, gave a French research team access to the teeth and bones held in the Russian State Archive. The results of the investigation are conclusive. As study lead Philippe Charlier told AFP, "The teeth are authentic. There is no possible doubt. Our study proves that Hitler died in 1945. We can stop all the conspiracy theories about Hitler. He did not flee to Argentina in a submarine. He is not in a hidden base in Antarctica or on the dark side of the moon." Charlier and his team discovered tartar stains on the teeth and no evidence of meat fibers. There were false teeth mixed in with the real teeth, which had blue stains on them that could have come from an interaction between cyanide and the metal in the dentures. Not only was Hitler a vegetarian, but he had terrible dental hygiene, bad breath in his later years, and few of his original teeth remaining. All of this information syncs up with the findings described in the study. Even more to the point, the teeth, jawbone, and dentures match an X-ray of Hitler's from 1944. Investigations into Hitler's Russian-held remains hit a bump in the road in 2009. Back then, Connecticut-based archaeologist and bone specialist Nick Bellinger Bellantoni came forward saying that he not only examined the skull fragments in the Russian State Archive, but discovered that they belonged to a woman under the age of 40. According to Slate, however, Russian authorities say they never gave Bellantoni access to Hitler's remains. Further conclusive evidence regarding Hitler's death comes from the former Führer's skull. The skull kept in storage in the Russian State Archive presents a morphology or shape that matches radiographic images of Hitler's skull taken before his death, much like the X-rays of his teeth. The skull itself had a hole on the left side, likely caused by an entering or exiting bullet, but because there were no remnants of chemicals like gunpowder on the teeth, it's likely that Hitler shot himself through the neck or forehead. The French team wasn't allowed to take any samples with them, so this information is all we're likely to get for a while. That being said, it's more than enough. A bloody couch, tattered documents, and bone fragments. Adolf Hitler left little behind when he ended his life after losing World War II. Here's what history remembers. World War II was a conflict that saw millions slaughtered and displaced across Europe and beyond. Nations such as France and Poland were devastated by aggression from Germany, which had been ruled since 1933 by the fascist and expansionist Nazi Party. However, 1944 saw a decisive shift in the fortunes in the conflict, with the Allied forces of the United States, United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France beginning to make inroads into Germany itself. Historians have highlighted the Battle of Stalingrad as the turning point, the moment when the Nazis saw their plan of maintaining two battlefronts in the east and west fall to pieces. In January 1945, with greater and greater swaths of the country falling under enemy occupation, the senior Nazis recognized that a sustained ground assault on Berlin, the center of the Nazi world, was imminent. As 1945 commenced and battles began to rage throughout a crumbling Berlin, the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler found that his fascist empire had shrunk to nothing. Since becoming Chancellor of Germany, Hitler had taken as his primary residence the Reich Chancellery, a sumptuous palace in the center of Berlin. But as artillery fire became more frequent, Hitler and his inner circle were restricted increasingly to the Führer bunker, a 3,000 square foot network of rooms 50 feet below the surface. Here too, Hitler would die by suicide alongside his wife of a single day, Eva Braun, though much of the evidence was cleared before the arrival of Allied forces. Adolf Hitler spent 105 days living almost completely below ground during the collapse of Nazi Germany. Despite being built primarily as an artillery defense and characterized by the slate-gray concrete in which it was encased, the Führer bunker was surprisingly luxurious, including dining rooms, a sumptuous study for the Nazi leader, and a conference room. It was here that Hitler married his lover Eva Braun shortly after midnight on April 29th, as Berlin was pounded by artillery strikes by the advancing Allied forces. Senior Nazis Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann were witnesses at the ceremony. They were part of a dwindling circle of loyalists who were willing to remain in Berlin as the city became encircled. Most of Hitler's former allies had left Berlin, but the wedding party, it seems, was preparing to go down with the ship.
The war is over. 6 years of suffering, sacrifice, and death.
The following day, Hitler and Braun entered the Nazi leader's study and failed to emerge. They were found slumped together on a couch, which was stained with blood from a gunshot wound at Hitler's temple. Braun's body was said to smell strongly of almonds, a sign that she had taken a cyanide pill, one of which had hours earlier been tested on Hitler's dog Blondie. Other dogs in the bunker were also killed. Goebbels and his wife died by suicide in the bunker, arranging the murders of their 6 children, also in the bunker, before they ended their own lives. 4 men died on the surface, attempting to flee Berlin. The suicidal end of Nazi Germany came immediately after news broke that the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, a key ally of the Nazis, had been shot to death. He died at the hands of partisans who posthumously strung him from a lamppost and desecrated his body. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels' suicides were carried out to avoid a similarly brutal fate. But Hitler was also keen to avoid having his dead body fall into Allied possession. As such, he ordered that his and Eva Braun's corpses be burned in the Reich Chancellery garden following their double suicide, an order which his loyalists carried out. When Soviet soldiers arrived at the Chancellery, they searched the connected bunkers extensively in hope of finding Hitler's corpse, but they didn't find it. All that is believed to remain of him is a fragment of cranium with a bullet hole and a piece of jawbone, the latter of which was confirmed as Hitler's using dental records. Soldiers also discovered a pile of gasoline cans, which were believed to have been used to torch the bodies.
If Hitler wasn't going to survive the war, he needed to sort of martyr himself for the Nazi cause.
After the conclusion of the war, the Allies went on to conduct extensive inquiries into the workings of Nazi Germany. They took little evidence from the bunker itself. Hitler's personal safe had been emptied of documents, which were then burned. So were documents belonging to Goebbels and other loyalists, preventing them from falling into enemy hands. Little knowledge of the exact circumstances of Adolf Hitler's death made it into the press until well after the end of World War II. The absence of his corpse fueled numerous conspiracy theories, and some suggest he actually escaped the bunker along with several other senior Nazis. But photos later emerged from the interior of the bunker that shed light on Hitler's final days. Sofa cushions and upturned furniture lay haphazardly among the dust and debris. Troops examined the death scene by candlelight, examining a couch on which Hitler's blood was still visible. Some items from inside the bunker, like fabric from the bloodied couch, tattered documents, and telephones, later found their way into museum collections. Hitler's suicide pistol has never been found and is assumed to have been taken by a soldier as a souvenir. The Reich Chancellery and the bunker were destroyed with dynamite in the years that followed. Did the great granddaddy of BSing foretell the rise of history's greatest evil? There's more to Nostradamus' Nazi predictions than meets the eye. Michel de Nostradamus, commonly known as Nostradamus, could be called the patron saint of the scammers and grifters permeating today's pop culture. For centuries, Nostradamus has been a household name, known for his eerie predictions about significant historical events. Many credit the 16th century astrologer with foretelling such world-changing moments as the Apollo moon landing, 9/11, and, as some think, even the rise of Hitler, writes Live Science. However, Nostradamus was not a prophet with superhuman abilities, obviously. Instead, he had a deep understanding of how human events repeat throughout history and that the dramas of the past will reoccur in the future. He was a master of constructing deceptive phrases that were purposely cryptic and could be easily misinterpreted over and over again as the years go by and new crops of curious people read his works. Early in his career, he worked as a doctor without any record of having completed his medical degree after he'd been kicked out of medical school, writes Britannica. The schemes only continued from there. At the time he was alive, spiritualism and an interest in the occult was all the rage in Europe. Astrology was on the rise, and Nostradamus used the hunger for celestial predictions to his advantage, according to Britannica. He gave astrological readings by mail, intentionally making his handwriting messy and difficult to read. Just imagine your doctor's handwriting, but 100 times worse. The Washington Post explains that Nostradamus often wrote in the language with which his recipient was the weakest to shroud his message further. Later, he would draw upon these elusive tactics as he wrote the predictions people still talk about today. The strength of Nostradamus' prophecies comes from their vagueness and his use of generalizations. Additionally, he carefully selected common events that recur throughout history: natural disasters, epidemics, and political despots. These repeated events make them easily applicable to the specificities of any era. This technique has historical precedent and was common enough to get its own name, bibliomancy, says history. Like Nostradamus, the bibliomancer lifts specific historical moments from old texts and then uses astrology to predict when the event will happen again. Nostradamus compiled his predictions into a book called Centuries, organized into sections containing 100 quatrains each. His writing uses intentionally obscure language, giving rise to multiple interpretations. For example, he often used New City to reference a location. Conveniently, New City can be applied to any burgeoning metropolis. Nef, another favorite word, could refer to a cathedral or a ship, providing two different predictions for each use. Further obscuring his prose, Nostradamus' quatrains have been mistranslated and misinterpreted. Prediction seekers find their answers by cherry-picking whichever poor translation best fits their need and then will ignore the rest. The linguist and translator Peter Lemajura in Live Science accuses these interpreters of, quote, shamelessly twisting half-understood words retrospectively to fit the proposed event, or in some cases, even twisting the event itself to fit the words. Such is the case with those who say Nostradamus predicted Hitler's rise to power.
Nostradamus' prophecy seems to converge with an actual historical figure, a man who very nearly conquered the world.
So did he really predict the Nazis' rise to power? At first glance, some of his quatrains really do seem to allude to Nazi Germany. Two seemingly relevant quotes read, "The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hitler," and "when the child of Germany observes nothing." Yet the Nazis understood how to wield Nostradamus' words to their advantage. According to history, Joseph Goebbels used Nostradamus' passages as propaganda, suggesting that Nazi success was written in the stars. On the other hand, the Allies quickly caught on and conveniently found quatrains that purportedly foretold an Allied victory. This exchange of countering predictions is an excellent example of how readers can manipulate Nostradamus' words to their desired outcome. However, these quatrains are no different than Nostradamus' other predictions, relying upon vagueness and multiple meanings. Life Science notes that Hister is an alternative spelling of Ister, which references the Danube River, not Adolf Hitler. The passages also predict details that aren't true. For example, how this new and dangerous leader would be born of poor people, even though Hitler's family was middle class. Look closely and the predictions fall apart. True, some of Nostradamus' lasting power is due to the pure fun of decoding words from the past. Yet it is helpful to remember that humans have a powerful ability to see what we want to see and filter out the rest. Nostradamus understood this all too well. Herbert Hoover had already gone down in history before the start of World War II. Among his many accomplishments and failures in that period, he became the only man to ever sit in both the Oval Office and the same room as Adolf Hitler. Herbert Hoover remains one of the better-known presidents of the United States, though not for the reasons a head of state might wish. The voting public held him responsible for the Great Depression, a stigma that remains attached to his name even after decades of historical research has put the economic downturn and his efforts to fight it into context.
In just 3 years, unemployment jumped from 2 to 13 million.
Those relief efforts were stymied in part by Hoover's own stubbornness and poor political skills. Unfortunately, his shortcomings as a leader in an economic crisis were only heightened by his bitterness and defeat. Angry that his successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would not heed his advice on the Depression during the transition, the Washington Post reported that Hoover called FDR a madman, while the UVA Miller Center reports that he described the New Deal as fascistic. Hoover's hostility to the Roosevelt administration made little difference during the election of 1936, and his unpopularity even led many Republicans to keep him at a distance. Despite his loss and poor reputation, Hoover continued to make genuine attempts at making a positive impact on the world. Before becoming president, Hoover had worked strenuously on post-World War I European relief, and many European nations honored him during the 1930s. This work caused him to travel overseas often, and it was on one of these trips that, in 1938, he was brought face-to-face with Adolf Hitler. It was the only time in his life that Hitler met a U.S. president, sitting or retired. It was an enlightening visit for Hoover, and an occasion for sensational overblown headlines back in America. Germany wasn't Herbert Hoover's final destination when he went to Europe in 1938. Rather, the German government invited him to visit while he was en route to Poland. Surviving paperwork, which was later auctioned off by Alexander Historical Auctions, reveals the details that went into preparing for Hoover's arrival. Reportedly, it was decided that Hoover would be brought to Adolf Hitler's personal residence, and government officials planned to receive the former president there upon his arrival. However, all this planning may not have been necessary had Hoover followed his first instinct. Reportedly, he was reluctant to make a stop in Nazi Germany on his way to Poland. After leaving office, he was an outspoken critic of fascism and communism for the ways both infringed on personal liberty. Relations between Germany and the United States were souring in 1938, which frustrated the Nazi government's efforts to secure trade agreements. The fact that America and Germany stood for such widely opposing ideologies was already becoming a fixed notion, even without the prospect of war on the immediate horizon. German officials compiled a list of talking points in preparation for the meeting, some of which summarized the existing tensions between the nations. Others concerned Hoover's well-known resentment for the Roosevelt administration. In one of his reports, General Baron Freytag von Loringhoven suggested engaging Hoover on the subject of Roosevelt, drawing out his opinions and his complaints about the New Deal. The reports also outlined lines of attack on the New Deal and advised denying any attempted influence by Nazi Germany on organizations like the American Federation of Labor. Hoover arrived in Berlin in March 1938. While there were other items on his itinerary, his 40-minute private audience with Hitler was understandably the most well-documented. Much of what we know about their meeting comes from a summary held in the National Archives based on translations of the meeting. According to this document, Hoover began his meeting with Hitler on a positive note. He favorably compared the state of Germany in 1938 to what he beheld 20 years earlier after the end of World War I. He highlighted how, after the war, Germany was, quote, depressed and despondent, but the nation's environment seemed much more lively and optimistic at the time of their meeting. He told Hitler that, compared to the United States, Germany's economic progress was rapidly outpacing America's. However, Hoover qualified this praise by noting that America's slower pace of building programs and organizations to facilitate such growth was due to the country's commitment to personal liberty.
Action of labor and management, which is one of the high purposes of the Recovery Act.
According to the Washington Post, Hitler replied that Germany couldn't afford to indulge such notions as it built itself up. The details of Hoover's meeting with Hitler were not available to the public for several years after the meeting, and at the time, Hoover had little to say on the subject. As he told the United Press, "I never discussed the character of such private conversations." Even so, the press widely reported that an anonymous source had divulged that the meeting turned into a contentious argument between the politicians. Headlines and stories loudly proclaimed that Hoover had fiercely defended the virtues of personal liberty against Hitler and Nazism. The claims were denied by both parties, and the translation of their meeting would later disprove these reports. While there were some tensions surrounding the meeting, it concerned a member of the press rather than an ideological disagreement. According to the National Archives, Paul Smith of the San Francisco Chronicle was with Hoover in Germany, and Hoover requested that the journalist accompany him to the meeting with Hitler in place of another individual. The request was denied, officially because it was too late to change the arrangements. However, it's more likely that Smith was refused because his newspaper often featured harsh criticism of Nazism. Hoover may not have given Hitler a stern talking to over liberty, but he did take with him some strong impressions of life under Nazi Germany that reinforced his hostility to fascism. According to the Presidential Primary Sources Project, Hoover was well aware that the Nazi regime's harshest realities were hidden from him during the trip. To confirm these suspicions, he left Berlin and visited the outskirts of Germany, where intellectuals confided in him the truth. The rest of his journey did little to assuage his concerns about the state of Europe, and he returned from the tour with a heightened understanding of how complex the situation with Germany was. But despite all he had seen, Hoover was still strongly opposed to any U.S. intervention in another European war. He wanted to avoid American involvement in a European war that would ally the U.S. with Soviet Russia, even if the fight was against fascism. Hateful of both ideologies and convinced that another war was coming, Hoover hoped that a war between Germany and Russia might see Hitler and Joseph Stalin finish each other off. Hoover did not believe Hitler would choose to strike the West when so much of his rhetoric was aimed against the East. As late as 1941, he opposed American involvement and the Roosevelt administration's Lend-Lease offering to the Soviets. According to the Miller Center, it was only after Pearl Harbor that Hoover came out in support of America's entry into World War II. With all his mad dreams of a racially pure Third Reich in ruins, Hitler decided to take his own life. That disappointed a lot of people who wanted the chance to kill him themselves. For months, Adolf Hitler had been increasingly sequestered underground in his Führer bunker as the Allies rained fire down upon Berlin. His armies were broken, his orders were being disregarded by his own generals, and the communists were coming for the capital and for him. By the end of April 1945, news had reached the Führer of the brutal killing of his ally Benito Mussolini. With that example before him and his war machine on its last quivering legs, he and his longtime companion Eva Braun died in a suicide pact and, per his will, were burned immediately after their deaths. When the Russians took custody of Berlin shortly after, they moved his remains several times before pulverizing them and scattering them, denying any lingering admirers of Hitler a grave to memorialize. It was an inglorious end for the 20th century's most prominent face of state evil. It was also a death free from the mob violence and dark catharsis of Mussolini's execution, or the sense of justice that came with the Nuremberg trials. But what if things had gone differently? What if Hitler had been put on trial? Or what if the Soviet army had got their hands on him? Here's how history might have played out differently if Hitler had been captured alive. Had Winston Churchill gotten his wish, Hitler's reprieve from death would have been brief, to say the least. Hitler's crimes were self-evident by 1945, and the British leader, for one, was not inclined to show him mercy. Churchill made plain his antipathy for Hitler and Nazism years before World War II began.
Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder.
His hatred for Hitler by mid-war was such that the Prime Minister already had a vivid and ruthless plan in mind for how to dispose of him. He declared in one cabinet meeting in 1942, "If Hitler falls into our hands, we shall certainly put him to death." He recommended the electric chair as an appropriate method for a man he declared a gangster. Churchill was still in favor of summary execution by 1945, dismissing any potential trial of Hitler or any other Nazi leader as a farce. But he faced opposition from his fellow Allied leaders. As one diplomatic exchange put it, "There must be no executions without trial, otherwise the world would say we were afraid to try them." The remaining Nazi leadership faced justice before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and contrary to Churchill's fantasies, it is likely Hitler would have been tried there had he been captured. Given the sentences handed down to many top brass at Nuremberg, it's almost certain Hitler would have been executed in the end, by hanging, not the chair. In some eyes, the justice of the Nuremberg trials was tainted by the involvement of the Soviet Union. There were several ironies to Soviets' involvement in prosecuting the Nazis for war crimes, like their one-time alliance with Nazi Germany, the involvement at Nuremberg of prosecutors who were party to Russian show trials, and the Soviets' attempt to pin the Katyn massacre on Germany. In fact, it was Joseph Stalin who was instrumental in establishing a post-war legal framework at all. Putting Nazi leadership on trial was, in his mind, a valuable piece of political theater that would bolster the Soviet Union's internal unity and international prestige. But Stalin envisaged something more akin to his show trials, something that he could puppet from afar. Might securing the top Nazi have let Stalin shape the trials more to his liking? The Russian position on the Eastern Front by 1945 gave him significant leverage at the Yalta Conference. Had Soviet troops taken Adolf Hitler alive, Stalin would have had another valuable bargaining chip. He might have won some concessions on the character of the tribunal as a price for extraditing Hitler for a joint Allied prosecution. Denied that, he may have had Hitler tried in Russia and used Hitler's own words as evidence, making the trial part of the ideological battle between capitalism and communism. One refrain of the defense sounded constantly throughout the Nuremberg trials. The defendants were just following orders. Expressed in so many words, it was the Nazi leadership's attempt to pass the buck onto the one man who could not stand before the International Military Tribunal. The defendants claimed that it was Adolf Hitler who set the policy, and his followers were unaware of the full and horrific consequences of that policy.
I did not know anything that took place or the methods that were used in the concentration camps later.
Given the intense professions of loyalty to Hitler by some of the Nuremberg defendants, you still have to wonder if they would have tried to pin the blame on him had he been alive. But Hitler would not have been able to lay the blame on higher authority. He could hardly plead ignorance either. Besides his status as the leader of Germany, there was ample evidence of Nazi atrocities. Many of those who were tried at Nuremberg didn't even attempt to claim that they hadn't done horrible things, only that they weren't responsible for them. Denied that defense, Hitler might have used a number of other arguments put forward during Nuremberg. He might have claimed that the charges amounted to post-ex facto law. He could also have claimed that war crime charges could only be levied at states, not individuals. Given that the tribunal rejected these defenses without Hitler, it's a safe bet they wouldn't have saved him from the noose.
He is determined that the Russians mustn't get hold of his body.
Had Russian soldiers been able to take Adolf Hitler alive, there is the possibility that he never would have lived to see Nuremberg. Having long been subjected to some of the most brutal conditions of the entire war at the hands of the Nazis, the behavior of the Red Army in Berlin at the end of World War II is infamous for its violence. In the words of one soldier, "We are taking revenge for everything, and our revenge is just. Fire for fire, blood for blood, death for death." The reputation of the Red Army was severe enough that the likes of Hermann Göring sought to surrender to the Western Allies rather than face the Soviets. While some Nazis, such as Hans Fritzsche, were taken prisoner by Russian forces and later extradited to Nuremberg, the sight of the supreme leader of the Nazis may have been too much for the rank and file. A mad soldier or an embittered officer might have had Hitler killed there in Berlin, not unlike Benito Mussolini's death at the hands of partisans at the Italian border. Could Adolf Hitler have lived to see conviction and execution at Nuremberg, even if he were captured? His health had collapsed by 1945, and theories have run rampant ever since about the state of his mind and body in his final months. It's long been thought that Hitler had Parkinson's disease. It's probable that he did, though the tremor seen in his hands and newsreels could also be explained as withdrawal symptoms. The opiates he was regularly injected with fell in short supply by the war's end. A military doctor who examined Hitler in his last days, Ernst Günther Schenk, was shocked by Hitler's hunched, shriveled appearance when he examined him. He later said, "His eyes, glaring at me painfully, were bloodshot, and the drooping black sacs under the eyes betrayed fatigue and sleeplessness. I was looking at the eyes of death. We all were doomed. I was looking into the eye of death." In such a physically weakened state, Hitler would have been ill-prepared to weather the harsh conditions of captivity at Soviet hands. And according to Schenk, one genuine ailment Hitler suffered from was arteriosclerotic heart disease. Illness, imprisonment, and the loss of the war in combination might have done him in before he could be put on trial.